Have you ever wondered why we call French fries, or why something is the greatest thing since sliced bread? There are answers to those questions. Everything Everywhere Daily is a podcast for curious people who want to learn more about the world around them. Every day, you'll learn something new about things you never knew you didn't know. Subjects include history, science, geography, mathematics, and culture. If you're a curious person and want to learn more about the world you live in, just subscribe to Everything Everywhere Daily wherever you cast your pod.
From the creators of the popular science show with millions of YouTube subscribers comes the Minute Earth podcast. Every episode of the show dives deep into a science question you might not even know you had. But once you hear the answer, you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Why do rivers curve? Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms? And why do so many more kids need glasses now than they used to? Spoiler alert, it isn't screen time. Our team of scientists digs into the research and breaks it down into a short, entertaining explanation, jam-packed with science facts and terrible puns. Subscribe to Minute Earth wherever you like to listen.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 560, Rock the Kasbah. Last time, the naval covering force for the three attacking groups going inland at French Morocco had their hands full, as elements of the French fleet kept pulling American vessels away so French destroyers could go after the landing craft just north of Casablanca. The Americans fell for this feint at least twice, but had the numbers to compensate before too much damage was done. Besides, the rough tides alone had taken out almost half of the landing craft allocated for this part of Torch. Still, between the ground troops, air attacks, and naval might, Casablanca was becoming less able to defend itself. As for the deep water harbor at Safi, to the south of Casablanca, the southern attacking force there had their own issues, but again, a combination of forces silenced the coastal guns, subdued the port, and weakened outlying French military posts like at Marrakesh. By November 10th, D-Day +2, the only strong French force in the south was at Bou-Guedra, east of Safi, but enough of Major General Harman's forces held them in check, while a part of the 2nd Armored Division broke off to head up the coast to approach Casablanca from the south. The Americans were learning much as they clashed with French forces on the ground, in the air, and on the sea, and they weren't even facing the Germans yet, which left the most northern American landing force against French Morocco at Mahdia. The plan was simple, direct, but vital. The forces of Goalpost, under Major General Truscott, would travel up the Cebu River with its upside-down U-shape and make for the all-weather airport at Port Ute. Once that was in American hands, they would be able to project power in any direction for a long distance. Problem was, the French knew they were there and already had ships in between the landing vessels and the Cebu River's mouth. Further, there was the 16th century Portuguese stone fortress called Kasbah, which held men and large guns, and the 3,000 French infantry at Port Ute itself, with additional troops further to the south. Truscott had delayed the final approach to Cebu, but then ordered the ships to go in. There was nothing else for it. Waiting for Port Ute to fall into American hands was Brigadier General John Cannon, commander of the 12th Air Support Command. Once that was done, he would have 77 P-40s leave the auxiliary carrier Chenango and land at Ute. Then, additional 12th Air Support planes would come from Gibraltar. They were all just waiting for the word. Besides the force that was to make its way up the Cebu River, there were to be 3 battalion landing teams that would unload at 5 beaches across 10 miles of the Media-Port Ute's coastline. But as covered last time, the pre-landing organization was all cocked up in the dark early morning hours of D-Day. Despite everything just mentioned, the landings actually started out well enough at 5:40 a.m. until they weren't, which did not take very long. Major John Dilley's 2nd BLT landed at Green Beach just south of Cebu's mouth. But French guns opened up, firing at those now coming ashore. But the destroyer USS Eberl used its guns to silence the French guns. But by 6:30 a.m., there was enough light for French DW-520 fighters and medium bombers from Rabat and Salé to fly over and strafe the GIs on shore and the warships protecting them. Adding to this defense, the guns of the Kasbah started firing on the transports. Taking too many hits in quick succession, the transports were pulled back 15 miles. Landing operations came to a halt, exposing the American soldiers on the beaches who were now running out of supplies. Truscott screamed for air support, and by 9 a.m., 20 Wildcats from Sangamon and the Ranger drove off the French planes, shooting down 9 of them. Safe for the moment from the air attacks, the GIs of the 2nd BLT drove inland and captured the local lighthouse, but who were then counterattacked by French infantry, supported by 75mm artillery. The lighthouse was just north of the Kasbah guns, so the Americans quickly started taking casualties and had to retreat almost all the way back to the beaches. And then came a sorrowful tale. French-speaking United States Army Air Force officers Colonel DeMaw Nick Craw and Major Pierpont Hamilton came ashore at daybreak. Their goal was to end this fighting. Using jeeps that came ashore before the landing craft were driven away, they drove with truce flags flying high directly to Port Ute. But as they got close, a nervous French machine gunner killed Craw. The colonel at Ute felt bad about what happened, but it was done. So, not sure what to do, he arrested Hamilton and he decided to wait to see how events would unfold. The southernmost landing was completed by Major Percy McCauley's 1st BLT. They were to have landed at Beaches Yellow, furthest south, and Blue, closer to Medea, about 2 miles south of it, but the tides had them landing further north than planned. They came ashore at 5:35 a.m., figured out the mistake, and began to reorganize before heading out. But this gave the French infantry closest to them time to prepare. Eventually, the 1st BLT moved out, heading northeast, but soon were stopped cold. And no matter what they tried, the French defenders before them kept them pinned down. In fact, BLT-1 would stay where it was until dusk. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel John Toffee's 3rd BLT was to have landed at Red Beach 2, just north of the mouth of the Cebu, and at Red Beach 1, a bit further north. But, again, the tides. These units landed 5 miles north of their destinations, cursed their luck, but then gathered together and started driving back to the southeast. And soon enough, these men were being strafed by French fighters. But the fighters came once often to the well, as the saying goes, and the Americans on the ground were able to shoot down 2 of them. The aircraft left, the men scaled the 160-foot coastal ridge and started heading further inland. Moving more south than east, they soon reached Hill 58, about 1 mile north of Port Ute, set up their defenses, and kept the closest French units busy so more men could land on the beach, not having to suffer what these original units did.
When Johann Rall received the letter on Christmas Day 1776, he put it away to read later. Maybe he thought it was a season's greeting and wanted to save it for the fireside. But what it actually was a warning, delivered to the Hessian colonel, letting him know that General George Washington was crossing the Delaware and would soon attack his forces. The next day, when Rall lost the Battle of Trenton and died from 2 colonial Boxing Day musket balls, the letter was found, unopened, in his vest pocket. As someone with 15,000 unread emails in his inbox, I feel like there's a lesson there. Oh well, this is The Constant, a history of getting things wrong. I'm Mark Chrysler. Every episode, we look at the bad ideas, mistakes, and accidents that misshaped our world. Find us at constantpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Major General Truscott came ashore that afternoon, and having been a part of the Dieppe raid, he recognized the ingredients of another impending disaster. But he was determined to turn things around. Yet he had to admit that none of the D-Day objectives had been met. His landing craft were still at risk, the surf was rising, and all of his reserves were already committed. Still, he and his were on shore, and he could easily guess the enemy's next move. As those French units in the area were not enough on their own to dislodge the Americans, a relief force would surely come from the south, so Truscott had all 7 M5 Stuart tanks move just south of Medea to block the Rabat highway. Sure enough, at 6 a.m. the next day, November 9th, the Stuarts engaged the French relief column. First, the enemy infantry was pushed back, and at 6:40 a.m., the 15 Renault R-35 tanks, with 2 French infantry battalions for support, were roughed up. 4 French tanks were destroyed. The Americans lost none of theirs. Not that the French were giving up. Reorganizing themselves for another attack, the French believed the wooded area they were in was sufficient protection. It was not. The light cruiser Savannah fired on the French, forcing them to go even further south. The Savannah kept firing, the French kept retreating. Soon, they were not a threat to the landing parties. But going back to the 1st BLT, the battalion that had landed furthest south from the Seydou River, they had lined up west to east, just in case the Savannah had been unable to stop the French relief force. But as that force kept retreating, this freed up the 1st BLT, so they now headed to the northeast, towards Port Ute. They still had 7 miles to go, not that it mattered, as they again ran into stiff French resistance. But during this fighting, the 2nd BLT, which had come ashore just south of the Cebu, tried to make for the Kasbah, but its guns held the Americans back. But not for a lack of trying. The Americans would rush forward, take casualties, and fall back, only to try again. But the 155mm fire from the stone fort was holding its own. The 3rd BLT, which had landed far to the north, but was now in the city proper, did a similar dance as had the 2nd BLT, but against smaller French artillery. But when darkness came that November 9th, Lieutenant Colonel Toffee broke off 3 of his BLT companies to do an end run around the fort's guns and make for Port Ute proper. They had some success getting closer, but soon, again, were mixing it up with French artillery and infantry. Still, during the night, the men of the 1st and 3rd BLTs crept closer to the airfield. Had the Americans been able to use all of their remaining landing craft, this might have gone better, but progress, slow progress, was being made. Truscott knew that something was needed to break this logjam, so he ordered the older destroyer USS Dallas to be stripped down of its complement and equipment. Then he loaded on 75 special assault troops, and the Dallas made for the mouth of the Cebu at 4 a.m., now November 10th. And the Dallas had an ace. The destroyer had its own captain, of course, but at the helm now was René Malverne, Port Ute's former, now Gaullist, harbor pilot. A few months earlier, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, had completed an operation at Medea, helping Malverne to escape by hiding in between empty oil barrels. Well, now he was back and using his intimate knowledge of the river and the French guns around it. Through the darkness and now heavy rains and the ebb tide, the Dallas did battle with them all, but it seemed the ship was going to lose. Running aground, the guns at the Kasbah took advantage of this. The shells started coming ever closer to the Dallas, so it poured on the power, but not necessarily the speed, as the silt made it all but impossible to advance. Still, the destroyer managed 2 knots, which was better than nothing. Straddled again by shells, suddenly the Dallas broke free and smashed into the river boom before Port Ute. The Kasbah would have to fire at something else. To be sure, there were other smaller French guns to deal with during the last part of their journey, but the Dallas's 3-inch guns silenced them. An assist came from the destroyer Kearney. Its guns took out a 75mm battery. Nearing the last turn, float planes from the Savannah did what they could to help as well. But seeing the Dallas go by them, the struggling GIs on the ground cheered, hoping it would reach the airfield soon. Past the last turn now, the Dallas pulled up as close as she could. It was 7:37 a.m., November 10th. The 75 raiders, not one man was hurt for all of this flying metal coming at them, climbed aboard their rubber boats and paddled to the airstrip. Meanwhile, the Dallas exchanged shells with the closest 75mm battery that was still operational. But it was a Savannah SOC Seagull aircraft that destroyed the 75 with depth charges. Necessity is the mother of invention. Between those 75 American assault troops and the men from the 3rd BLT's company, they took possession of the airfield at 8 a.m. When the rest of the 3rd BLT showed up, they secured the remainder of Port Ute.
Have you ever thought about what would happen if your airline window popped out? Or if you can build a jetpack using only machine guns? Turns out you can, but you really shouldn't. Hi, I'm Jill Chacha, host of a podcast that's for weird people who like learning about weird stuff. It's called, well, That's Interesting. And it's a comedy sciencey show that tells the story behind the facts, because as it turns out, those stories are funny. Every Thursday, I tell the tale behind a new, odd discovery, like how researchers found 2 mysterious structures surrounding Earth's core, or how it's actually possible to stop hiccups using a rectal massage. Yes, there's a story behind that, no pun intended, and I tell the story because storytelling is the perfect way to learn and remember. The facts are bizarre, the stories are epic, and the laughter is plentiful, so join the flock and listen to Well, That's Interesting, wherever you do podcasts.
Not that everything was going well. The 2nd BLT was still trying to take the Kasbah. The GIs had the area around the fort cleared by 9:30 a.m. that November 10th, but the fort itself was still defiant. So, 2 M7 Priests, self-propelled artillery vehicles, fired 105 mm rounds point blank, but the stones of the fort were still there. Upon hearing this, and after some more cursing, Truscott called in a naval airstrike. Why go through the walls if you can go over them? Soon, 4 Avengers and 3 Wildcats were dropping dozens of 100-pound bombs on the old Portuguese fort. Then the GIs nearest fixed bayonets and charged in, running through the rain. The 250 French troops inside were now prisoners, but it had cost Truscott 225 casualties. Being old school, Truscott was heard to have said before this operation he was hoping for a bayonet charge, like in times past, which may partially explain why he did not call on the Navy earlier for help. No time for recriminations. A strong French force was now coming at Port Ute, this time from the east, specifically from Meknes. But perhaps learning a lesson, Truscott wasted no time in ordering a naval response to this latest threat. The battleship Texas, 17,000 yards out, so 9.5 miles, fired 214 14-inch high-explosive rounds at the French column. There were only 5 direct hits, but it turns out that was enough. The French column turned around. Then another French relief attack started coming from the south, again from Rabat, but the naval air and guns encouraged them to turn around as well. Now the Americans had the all-weather airfield, and lots of planes were landing, and they would need fuel and ammunition. For this, months ago, the U.S. Navy had requisitioned the Standard Fruit Company's SS Contessa. Problem was, her crew, not wanting to sail into a war zone, mutinied. As they say, the show must go on. So the U.S. Navy went up and down the coastline of Norfolk, through her jails, and press-ganged convicts until there was enough for a crew. The Contessa got underway on schedule. Back to the present, late on November 10th, Malvern, the man of the hour, piloted his second American vessel up the Cebu River to the airfield, and for this he would be awarded the Silver Star. Between losing the airfield and the American might in the form of destroyers and aircraft, the French in the area were now ready to negotiate. The fighting officially stopped at 4 a.m., November 11th. Next time, we'll watch as General Patton comes ashore at Fadala, and his first duty, self-appointed, was to play traffic cop after taking one look at the logistical nightmare on his beaches. His goal, as he told his staff, was to flay the idle, rebuke the incompetent, and drive the timid. Turns out, Patton was good at all three. Greetings from Central Virginia. So we finally got the American forces at all three places. Things are going well. They just got to consolidate. But as hinted at, Patton's still got to deal with issues around where he's at. So anyways, I'd like to thank the latest member. Let's see here. Stephen, is it Hager from Fresno, California? Thank you very much, Stephen. And as far as a donation, thank you very much to Glenn. Is that Gronseth? And Glenn, I would very much like to receive information you were putting in your message about your father's informal World War II memories, about his road from Normandy to Berlin. So yeah, Glenn, whenever you figure that out, and trust me, I'm no expert on technology, but whenever you do, I would love to take a gander at that. That would be cool. So anyways, so I'll see you next week with the next episode, and yeah, we'll just go from there, and then eventually we get to start the whole Patton Monty, I'm going to use the word partnership, but I think you know what I mean. Take care, everyone.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.